All right. Good morning. Welcome to Bible study. Today is Wednesday, May 5th, and we are in Deuteronomy chapter 13. So in Deuteronomy chapter 13, we've been building through Moses's last sermon to the people before they enter the promised land. And we are going to continue through Deuteronomy, but this is building on all of the history that's come before, with God's call to Abraham, with the chosen people being called out of Egypt. And now they've wandered around the wilderness for an entire generation, allowing the old folks who were rebellious to die off. And now Moses is getting ready to transfer leadership and to die as well. So in chapter 13, once again, Moses is saying, don't commit adultery and idolatry. Suppose there are prophets among you, or those who dream dreams about the future, and they promise you signs or miracles, and the predicted signs or miracles occur. If they then can say, come, let us worship other gods, gods you have not known before, do not listen to them. The Lord your God is testing you to see if you truly love him with all your heart and soul. So one of the things that our culture is going through right now is a great deal of spirituality, but without religion. So there are lots of people who would describe themselves as spiritual, but not religious. There are lots of people who work with crystals and zodiac signs and dream work and all of these methods to approach the Creator. And some of them say that they work, that they get insight or knowledge or wisdom, or that they feel good for doing these things. And God here is acknowledging through Moses that yes, some of these things work. They may be able to tell you things or tell you about your dreams or tell you about the future, but if they use those to lead you away from the Lord your God, don't do that. Don't use that. Don't seek after knowledge that doesn't come from God. Serve only the Lord your God and fear him alone. Obey his commands, listen to his voice, and cling to him. The false prophets or visionaries who try to lead you astray must be put to death, for they encourage rebellion against the Lord your God, who redeemed you from slavery and brought you out of the land of Egypt. Since they try to lead you astray from the way the Lord your God commanded you to live, you must put them to death. In this way, you will purge the evil from among you. Okay, so remember, we are talking about a particular time, a particular place. Some Christians and other groups have taken this verse out of context and have had inquisitions where they killed a bunch of people. We have the Salem witch trials, where women, largely women who were medicinal healers or women who were wise, were killed as a result of some of these kinds of verses that says anything that leads you astray should be killed. This is not talking about people out there outside of your community who are engaging in these practices or behaviors. This particular verse is saying, suppose you have a prophet among you, meaning you got a brother, sister, mother, cousin, who is an Israelite Jew and begins to talk about the future and miracles, and then is trying to use these practices to get you to go worship Baal or some other god. That is a person that should be put to death under this law, because they are someone who knows the true love of the Lord your God and is actively trying to pull people away from that faith and into this other faith, and they should be put to death as a danger to the community. Again, this was for those particular people in that particular time. It didn't say go out and kill all of the wise women who live out elsewhere. All right, so verse 6, suppose someone secretly entices you, even your brother, your son or daughter, your beloved wife, or your closest friend, and says, let us go worship other gods, God that neither you nor your ancestors have known. They might suggest that you worship the gods of peoples who live nearby or who come from the ends of the earth. You must put them to death. Strike the first blow yourself, and then all the people must join in. Stone the guilty ones to death because they have tried to draw you away from the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of slavery. Again, this is a very harsh penalty, but God is attempting to instruct the people that when you follow after false gods, death and destruction comes anyway. And this was very specifically meant for a people who were entering into a hostile land, and a land filled with religions that sacrificed children and had fertility god practices that used exploitive sex, and some very bad practices that were fundamentally an endanger to the common good and the value that God places on humanity. And that is why there's this really high price. And again, this was for the Israelites then going into the promised land. Verse 11. Then all Israel will hear about it and be afraid, and no one will act so wickedly again. The idea was this punishment would prevent others from trying to go this way as well. Verse 12, when you begin living in the towns the Lord your God is giving you, you may hear that scoundrels among you are leading their fellow citizens astray by saying, let us go worship other gods, gods you have not known before. In such cases, you must examine the facts carefully. If you find that the report is true and such a detestable act has been committed among you, you must attack that town and completely destroy all its inhabitants, as well as all the livestock. Then you must pile all the plunder in the middle of the open square and burn it. Burn the entire town as a burnt offering to the Lord your God. The town must remain a ruin forever. It may never be rebuilt. Keep none of the plunder that has been set apart for destruction. Then the Lord will turn his fierce anger and be merciful to you. He will have compassion on you and make you a large nation, just as he swore to your ancestors. The Lord your God will be merciful only if you listen to his voice and keep all his commands that I am giving you today. Do what pleases him. So again, you don't get to profit off of false accusations. You need to investigate and make sure they're true. And if these people are gaining goods through immoral practices, you don't get to keep their goods by killing them off. The idea being there's no incentive created for this practice. There's no incentive being created to either go worship false other gods, and there's also no incentive being to false accuse people of doing this, because you can't profit off of it. This is not true when you come to the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, or when you come to the witch trials that largely took over the country in the 1600s. What you had then was often women who were landowners or women who had particularly knowledge or skill, or who refused to marry someone in power, were accused. And then their accusers and the city and community took their goods and their wealth. So it's very important to realize that God attempted to set this up in a way that did not incentivize people to sin. Chapter 14, ceremonially clean and unclean animals. Since you are the people of the Lord your God, never cut yourselves or shave the hair above your foreheads in mourning for the dead. You've been set apart as holy to the Lord, and he has chosen you from all the nations of the earth to be his own special treasure. So this is kind of a weird thing for us. Why would you cut your hair when someone died? Well, there were some spiritualistic practices that were done with hair. but also it was a symbol of mourning. People would shave off their head and their hair. There is a value placed to our hair in religion, in many different religions, but also in the traditional Jewish culture. Hair was a woman's adornment and also should be covered in prayer, which is why you would see a very observant Jew wearing a yarmulke, which would be a male covering his head before he prayed. And very Orthodox women would wear a wig so that their hair would not be seen, or would wear a head covering. And we'll hear more and more as we go throughout the scriptures about hair and this idea that it is our sort of sacred adornment. But yes, we're not to cut our hair in mourning for the dead. This idea that we don't want to create any sort of ritualized practices around grief that point to something other than God. Verse 3, you must not eat any detestable animals that are ceremonially unclean. These are the animals you may eat: ox, sheep, goat, deer, gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the addax, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has completely split hooves and chews the cud, but if the animal doesn't have both, it may not be eaten. So you may not eat the camel, the hare, or the hyrax. They chew the cud, but do not have split hooves, so they are ceremonially unclean for you, and you may not eat the pig. It has split hooves, but does not chew the cud, so it is ceremonially unclean for you. You may not eat the meat of these animals, or even touch their carcasses. Of all the marine animals, you may eat whatever has fins and scales. You may not, however, eat marine animals that do not have fins and scales. They are ceremonially unclean for you. So we've talked about this before in Leviticus when we covered it, but the reason for the cleanliness codes of animals were not just because God was saying, well, you can have this food, but not this food. But there are actually some really good reasons why these foods were prohibited, and they have to do with food safety. Trichinosis and other diseases are much more common in pork, and pork tends to be undercooked because it gets tough when you cook it at a high enough temperature to kill off these diseases. So there's reasons of health and sanitation and protection to avoid those. As well as notice the seafood that's being excluded here is mostly bottom dwellers, crustaceans, bottom feeding fish that would be subject to pollution. So a lot of these filter feeder animals that are being prohibited, their whole role in creation is actually to filter out pollution and to help cleanse the water. And so what do you think happens when you eat the creatures that are eating pollution? Back in the day of society, that people would throw their excrement into the water. You could get very, very sick. And so again, this was a way of protecting people to ensure that they stayed healthy. So now we're going to move on to birds. You may eat any bird that is ceremonially clean. These are the birds you may not eat: the griffin vulture, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon, buzzards of all kinds, ravens of all kinds, the eagle owl, the short-eared owl, the seagull, hawks of all kinds, the little owl, the great owl, the barn owl, the seagull, hawks of all kinds, the little owl, the great owl, the barn owl, the desert owl, the Egyptian vulture, the cormorant, the stork, herons of all kinds, the hoopoe, and the bat. Okay, so there's a big theory that says that if we didn't have people eating bats, we wouldn't have the coronavirus pandemic right now. Also, a lot of these birds are carrion birds or vultures, things that eat dead, rotting nastiness. Not generally a good idea to consume those, especially if you're not sure that you're cooking them to a safe internal temperature. So The food codes were not meant to be this arbitrary punishment, but were meant to be a protective measure, one that we no longer need so much as society has evolved and we've had better cooking and sanitation. But again, there's some wisdom in this, and maybe we should go back to not eating bats. All winged insects that walk along the ground are ceremonially unclean for you and may not be eaten, but you may eat any winged bird or insect that is ceremonially clean. Insects, not something that makes up most of our diets, but something that worldwide provides a great deal of protein and is allowed for certain insects. Why no winged insects that walk along the ground? Those are the ones that tend to be attracted to poop or fecal matter or excrement, and therefore pass along germs. So God's like, don't eat those. No. Verse 21, you must not eat anything that has died a natural death. You may give it to a foreigner living in your town, or you may sell it to a stranger, but do not eat it yourselves, for you are set apart as holy to the Lord your God. All right, so God says, listen, you got a cattle that died of old age, you can't eat it. You're set apart as holy, but you can sell its meat. It's not necessarily bad, or it's just not good. It's not the best. And so don't eat it. You must not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay. This is where you get the kosher codes that separate dairy from meat entirely so that they don't ever accidentally do this. But yeah, I can't imagine boiling a young kid goat in the mom's milk, but God says don't do that. And then we transition from food to tithes. And that seems like a transition to us. Okay, we're going from talking about food to we're going to talk about money. But remember, this society was largely based on agrarian and livestock. So food and money are thoroughly intertwined for the Israelites. And so God says you must set aside a tithe of your crops, 1/10 of all the crops you harvest each year. Bring this tithe to the designated place of worship, the place the Lord your God chooses for his name to be honored, and eat it there in his presence. This applies to your tithes of grain, new wine, olive oil, and the firstborn males of your flocks and herds. Doing this will teach you to always fear the Lord your God. Again, teaching us that everything comes from God, and therefore to be grateful and thankful for what we have. That's the goal of setting something aside. But also, what it's talking about, you can eat of these in the presence of God. It's talking about having these religious festivals, that the new wine festival, the new grain festival, these festivals where all the people were gathered together to celebrate what God had done for them in their community by bringing this crop. It was meant to create this intentional rotation of times of rest and times for people to gather together and celebrate. And I think COVID has really taught us how much we miss and really need and rely on these times where we gather together and we celebrate. And I am looking forward to being able to do that one day soon. Verse 24, now when the Lord your God blesses you with a good harvest, the place of worship he chooses for his name to be honored might be too far for you to bring the tithe. If so, you may sell the tithe portion of your crops and herds, put the money in a pouch, and go to the place the Lord your God has chosen. So if you live far away, you don't have to drive your cattle or your flock or bring all of this grain in. You can sell it and set that money aside. This is how most of us conduct our economy these days. We sell our expertise or our skills or a product that we make. We convert it into money that we receive from our employer, and then we give 1/10 of that or whatever we've chosen to give to God. And that's just fine. Verse 26, when you arrive, you may use the money to buy any kind of food you want: cattle, sheep, goats, wine, or other alcoholic drink. Wait, what? We could use our tithe on having a party? Yes. Episcopalians sometimes get a bad rap for being drinkers or being people who have a lot of fun and parties, but it's biblical. You are meant to have a feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and celebrate with your household. And it says, do not neglect the Levites in your town, for they will receive no allotment of land among you. So not only do you need to have a party, bring your money, have some beer, have some wine, have street food. It'll be delicious and awesome, but make sure you invite the Levites to the party too and help provide for them. At the end of every 3rd year, bring the entire tithe of that year's harvest and store it in the nearest town. Give it to the Levites, who will receive no allotment of land among you, as well as to the foreigners living among you, the orphans and the widows of your town, so they can eat and be satisfied. The Lord your God will bless you in all your work. So every 3rd year, instead of just taking your tithe and using it to have your own festival, you're to set it aside for the Levites to have provision for their year. I don't know exactly how it worked, but presumably there was some sort of rotation. So it wasn't just every 3rd year the Levites got food from everybody, but that, certain families, it was their 3rd year one year, and certain families, it was their 3rd year another. And therefore we were all supporting the Levites in this rotation. So in chapter 15, we talk about release for debtors. I want to start by prefacing and saying that there is no evidence of a large-scale following of this in the Israelite culture. And that may be part of why we don't get too far along before we find that we're in Kings and Judges and the people have gone astray and done evil in the eyes of the Lord. This was set up as an ideal, and we have some evidence that they followed it some of the time, but in terms of consistently long-term, not so much. So at the end of every 7th year, you must cancel the debts of everyone who owes you money. This is where you get bankruptcy from. This is where you get that, your debts for 7, and bankruptcy lingers for 7 years, and then it's all done, and you theoretically are free to start over. It's where we get sort of that law is from this law. This is how it must be done. Everyone must cancel the loans they have made to their fellow Israelites. They must not demand payment from their neighbors or relatives, for the Lord's time of release has arrived. This release from debt, however, applies only to your fellow Israelites, not to the foreigners living among you. Verse 4, there should be no poor among you, for the Lord your God will greatly bless you in the land he's giving you as a special possession. This may be controversial, but I wonder how different our world would be if we said our goal is for there to be no poor among us. Because we live in a land of wealth and prosperity, and we live in a land that is productive and good. And so therefore, what if we just modeled our society on the assumption that no one should be poor? And how could we actually do that? Well, I don't know. But I know it begins by not blaming the poor. And it begins by not saying, well, if you just work harder and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you wouldn't have these problems. I think it begins with trying to set up a society where there isn't this massive wealth and income inequality, where billions and billions and billions of dollars are concentrated in the hands of a few, whereas those who work for those major employers are living in subsistence wages. But again, how awesome would it be if we could set aside our political ideology and simply start from an assumption there should be no poor among us? Verse 5, You will receive this blessing if you are careful to obey all the commands the Lord your God and I am giving you today. The Lord your God will bless you as he has promised. You will lend money to many nations, but will never need to borrow. You will rule many nations, but they will not rule over you. But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns, when you arrive in the land your Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Instead, be generous and lend them whatever they need. Do not be mean-spirited and refuse someone a loan, because the year of canceling debts is close at hand. If you refuse to make the loan and the needy person cries out to the Lord, you will be considered guilty of sin. Give generously to the poor, not grudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. There will always be some in the land who are poor. That is why I am commanding you to share freely with the poor and with other Israelites in need. So again, this is one of those verses taken out of context where we've had people say, well, the poor will always be with you. Yeah. But what else goes along with that verse? Commanding you to share freely with the poor and with those in need. There will always be needs in our society that we ourselves cannot fill for ourselves. I say this as a recovering perfectionist and a very independent person. I hate asking for help. I hate having other people help me or needing other people's help. And I had to get up and over that and to grow up and say, I don't have every skill. I don't have all the wealth in the world. And sometimes I'm going to be equipped to help others. And sometimes I'm going to need others' help. That's part of what it means to live in an interdependent society. There are always going to be people who need something. And if we have the means, we should give it to them and help them. That's what God says. But again, what does that look like? I think it looks like by embracing the idea that God wants everyone to have enough to eat. God wants people to have stable, loving homes. God wants people to have Sabbath rest and not working 3 or 4 jobs to make ends meet. And so if we can look at what God wants, then we can begin to say, what can we do to move closer to that? So release for Hebrew slaves. If a fellow Hebrew sells himself or herself to be your servant and serves you 6 years, in the 7th year you must set that servant free. So, indentured servitude is in the Bible. This idea that you may get so low and have so little that literally all you have is your own labor. It was permissible to sell yourself for a period of time, but it was never forever. And notice what comes next is provision and care for these people, that they would, after such a time, have enough to start over and not be trapped into a cycle of slavery. Verse 13, when you release a male servant, do not send him away empty-handed. Give him a generous farewell gift from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. So they should have animals, crops, and wine. Share with him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. This idea that this person labored to help you for this many years to gain what you have, you give a portion of that to them at the end for them to move forward and start out again. Remember that you were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. This is why I'm giving you this command. But suppose your servant says, I will not leave you, because he loves you and your family, and he has done well with you. In that case, take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door. After that, he will be your servant for life, and do the same for your female servants. Again, this is meant to be a voluntary entering into a contract with someone where you've taken good care of me. I enjoy working with you and for you. I am choosing to stay with you and to continue to live as a member of your household. Unfortunately, these verses were used to justify a false narrative of American slavery that pushed this idea that Black people were perfectly happy to serve good masters. And while I suppose it is possible that there were the occasional good master that treated their slave well, again, this plan was for Hebrews with Hebrews, not a people in power subjugating a different kind of people, and not a permanent, involuntary entering into of a covenant or a contract, and certainly not a we're going to force you to breed even more slaves for us to profit off of. So this should not be applied to American slavery, but it was at certain points. Verse 18, you must not consider it a hardship when you release your servants. Remember that for 6 years they have given you services worth double the wages of hired workers, and the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So the idea that they were worth more because of how much of their time they gave to you, and you don't get to grouse or complain about having to set them up and send them off ready to start a new life. Yeah, unfortunately, human beings tend to be exploitive of others, and I don't know how well we could do these types of arrangements ever, because we've just not historically succeeded well, but it is what it is. Sacrificing firstborn male animals. You must set aside for the Lord your God all the firstborn males from your flocks and herds. Do not use the firstborn of your herds to work your fields, and do not shear the firstborn of your flocks. Instead, you and your family must eat these animals in the presence of the Lord God each year at the place he chooses. But if this firstborn animal has any defect, such as lame or blindness, you must, or if anything else is wrong with the animal, you must not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. So again, sometimes when we read these sacrifice laws, we forget that these were actually meant to be a blessing for the people. They would go and they would have a feast and a party. But don't choose your worst animal, and also don't allow the firstborn, if there's a defect, to be given to God. But you could still use it for food. Verse 22, instead use it for food for your family in your hometown. Anyone, whether ceremonially clean or unclean, may eat it, just as anyone may eat a gazelle or a deer, but you must not consume the blood. You must pour it on the ground like water. So anybody could benefit from this feast that you were supposed to have, but don't drink the blood. So we're going to go into chapter 16 and talk once again about the festival of the Passover. In honor of the Lord your God, celebrate the Passover each year in the early spring in the month of Abib, for that was the month in which the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. Your Passover sacrifice may be either from the flock or the herd, and it must be sacrificed to the Lord your God at the designated place of worship, the place he chooses for his name to be honored. Eat it with bread made without yeast. For 7 days the bread you eat must be made without yeast, and when you escaped from Egypt in a hurry. Eat this bread, the bread of suffering, so that as long as you live, you will remember the day you departed from Egypt. Let no yeast be found in any house throughout your land for those 7 days. And when you sacrifice the Passover lamb on the evening of the first day, do not let any of the meat remain until the next morning. You may not sacrifice the Passover in just any of the towns that the Lord your God is giving you. You must offer it only at the designated place of worship, the place your God chooses for his name to be honored. Sacrifice it there in the evening as the sun goes down on the anniversary of your exodus from Egypt. Roast the lamb and eat it in the place the Lord your God chooses. Then you may go back to your tents the next morning. For the next 6 days, you may not eat any bread made with yeast. On the 7th day, proclaim another holy day in honor of the Lord your God, and no work may be done on that day. So we got festival of the Passover, and now we're going to have the festival of the harvest. Count off 7 weeks from when you first begin to cut the grain at the time of harvest. Then celebrate the festival of the harvest to honor the Lord your God. Bring him a voluntary offering in proportion to the blessings you've received from him. This is a time to celebrate before the Lord your God at the designated place of worship he will choose in his name to be honored. Celebrate with your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites from your town, and the foreigners, orphans, and widows who live among you. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, so be careful to obey all these decrees. So we're going to have a party to celebrate the harvest, and the party includes everybody. And you bring your offering. So if you had a really good harvest that year, you should bring a lot. If you had not such a good one, bring a little. But the idea that everybody gathering together would have enough so that everybody in the town, even those who didn't have land, would be able to celebrate and eat and enjoy a time of rest. A lot of rural places in America and others still have these sorts of festivals where everybody works really, really hard in the season of harvest, from as long as there's light, to get all this brought in and done. Because if you leave it too long in the fields, it rots, the animals eat it, it's not good. And so you work your butt off during harvest season. And when you're done, you're ready to have a time to rest and celebrate. And I think it's amazing that God honors these needs for rest and celebration. So next we have the Festival of Shelters. This is sometimes called the Festival of Booths or the Festival of Tabernacles or Sukkot. This is many names for the same festival. For 7 days at the end of the harvest season, after the grain has been threshed and the grapes have been pressed, this festival will be a happy time of celebrating with your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows from your town. For 7 days you must celebrate this festival to honor the Lord your God at the place he chooses. For it is he who blesses you with the bountiful harvest and gives you success in all your work. This festival will be a time of great joy for all. So that, we have had in the early spring, we've had the Passover. Sometime later spring, midsummer, we've had the Festival of the Harvest. The Festival of the Harvest. And now we're looking into the fall, and we have the Festival of the Shelters after all the harvesting is done and the other crops have come in and been processed. And so we have this sort of rhythm that you're going to have some time to rest and relax and have fun. And I hope when we can all get back to normal, we create this rhythm in our own church of having, every few months or so, a time to gather and celebrate and just enjoy one another. Because I think it's really important. So verse 16. Each year, every man in Israel must celebrate these 3 festivals, the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of the harvest, and the festival of shelters. On each of these occasions, all men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he chooses, but they must not appear before the Lord without a gift for him. All must give as they are able, according to the blessings given to them by the Lord your God. Verse 18, appoint judges and officials for yourselves from each of your tribes in all the towns the Lord your God is giving you. They must judge the people fairly. You must never twist justice or show partiality. Never accept a bribe, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and corrupt the decisions of the godly. Let true justice prevail so you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You must never set up a wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build for the Lord your God, and never set up sacred pillars for worship, for the Lord your God hates them. So remember, we started off talking about idolatry, and we're ending a section talking about idolatry. And what's come in between these bookends, are this idea that what helps us to not do idolatry is to continually give to God of what we've received, to have mercy and relieve the debts of others, and to celebrate festivals and times of togetherness, and to have justice for for the people in our communities. And this idea that all of these are intertwined, and right worship of God helps us to have right relationship with people and vice versa. So we're going to end there today, and we'll pick up in chapter 17 next week. I'm going to make sure I mark it this time with my sticky note.